Okay, we've got it on your camera now. Okay. You still on the screen? All right. All of you can see that okay. Okay, that background is okay, this is Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and being taught at the Bear Valley Bible Institute of Denver. We're glad to have all of you in the class. It's obvious that you want to learn more and to do more in the Lord's service. And I can't think of three better books to address than these three in reference to where we are today as a society and where we are today as a church. You look around, at least in places where I preach, there is a shallow Bible knowledge exhibited by members, sometimes even exhibited in pulpits. We have a generation that's absolutely, completely given over to, you're going to have to entertain me or I am not going to participate. And that tells us that they really don't always understand who we are and don't understand what we're supposed to be doing. In these three books, we have related to us and for us God fulfilling His promise in a physical way to Israel, and that is delivering the people of the land of Canaan into their hand, allowing them to have the land He promised their father Abraham, and allowing them to be successful in their personal lives. He promised all those things. And also to make sure that they multiplied and they were fruitful. All those things come true in the book of Joshua. Even after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they all come true in the book of Joshua. And when we look at this book, there is tremendous triumph. That is, when they're doing it God's way, everything God said is coming true. But yet what they will forget in the book of Judges, and what we often forget today, is when you stop doing what God tells you to do, God will stop blessing you. You see, when we go back and we look at what was promised in the book of Deuteronomy, and He emphasized to them, this land is going to be yours. You're going to have vineyards you haven't planted. You're going to have houses you haven't built. There are going to be walls of protection you have not erected. And they're all going to be yours. But if you disobey me, I am going to drive you out of that land, just like I'm allowing you to drive these enemies out. He was very specific. He told them directly what He was going to do. And He told them specifically what He expected of them. Much like He has directed us in a spiritual way today. We have the spiritual application of the promise made to Abraham, that through Abraham's seed all the nations of earth be blessed. We understand that that's in Christ. And that those things that we are to do for the Lord, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 and 9, are completely linked to obedience. You remove the obedient part and you're not going to be able to represent God, nor are you going to have a blessing of God. Though He were a son, yet learned He obedience by the things which He suffered. Being made perfect, He became the author, and here it is, the author of eternal salvation. You see, they had this physical salvation from their enemies. He authored eternal salvation to all them that obey Him. Now, when we get to the book of Judges, and there arose a generation that knew not Jehovah, nor the great things that He had done, and we understand these things are written for our learning, and we have that contrast. Tremendous success when you have leadership that reminds them of who God is and what God has done and what God expects. And a colossal failure when you have no leadership and a generation that doesn't know God at all. They're not in awe of God. They don't remember the great things He's done. And so what do? You have a generation that's described as every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Sound familiar? We can get caught up in that, see? We need to learn those lessons in this study this week. It'll help us say, now, how can we apply in our lives today and our responsibilities as Christians today these principles so that we can have all the spiritual blessings God promises. And so we can avoid all those failures. I was telling some of them during the pre-class discussion that at Cordova we've given the entire year to that specific theme, mentoring and motivating the next generation. Where is the church going to be? We can only have any impact in a real way where we are. And there's some wisdom behind what God intended with each church being autonomous. So if most of us did go astray, all of us don't have to. But, you know, we can really only affect that locally. But locally, what are we doing? What do we plan for the next generation to know? You're going to say, well, we got to raise our children in the faith. What does that mean? How do we do that? Well, you know, we really need to study the Bible every day. How are we doing that? Well, you know, we really need to make sure that our Bible classes are focused and they collect us together, and all of us who've been studying as families, and we come together and we dig a little deeper, and we need to have a plan. How are we doing that? You see, if not, we'll get 20, 25, 30 years down the road. There'll be a generation that doesn't know anything. Why? Either the present generation didn't teach them, or they didn't listen. So when we read through these books, let's pay attention to why they were successful and what they were doing while they were successful. And then let's pay real close attention to what happened when they were no longer successful. And then right at the end of our study, I think it's unique that we have this real personal book. This little backdrop of what's going on behind the scene with all this national images going on with Joshua and conquering the land and tribes dividing the land. And then we have this secular thing going on in the book of Judges, and sometimes they're up and sometimes they're down, and it just says, oh, guess what's going on in the life of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. It's real personal. Right during the time all these things we're reading about in the book of Judges, it specifically tells us the book of Ruth takes place when they were judges, and so we kind of know when it was. But it tells us everyday life goes on. Even when there are great stories to be told in history, real life was going on. And there were some people doing it right. Whereas a nation, they weren't represented as being righteous before God. There were some righteous people going on with their lives. And so we want to learn that as we progress through this study together. This particular book, the book of Joshua, we assume is written by Joshua. Again, there are critics who would deny that, but we assume that because the Hebrew Talmud refers to that being the case, and those who were closest to that era and those who have access to how often it was used and who it was that used it gave that credit to Joshua. And so we don't have any reason not to. It gets a little complicated at the end when Joshua dies, and you look at that multiple ways. Could Joshua have recorded his own death? Well, sure he could have. You know, there are plenty of Old Testament folks who said this is what's going to happen. Though it's recorded of Moses, how he died, and some assume Joshua wrote the death of Moses. And it's assumed that maybe the high priest wrote the death of Joshua into the book. Those things really don't matter. What does matter is the truths that are recorded there. We want to look at those truths together as we study this book. So, when we talk about Hebrew history, who are we talking about? Hebrews. Who are they? Who are the Hebrews?
The children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob.
All right. the children of Israel, and we keep backing that up, before they were known as the children of Israel, then here were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we go all the way back to Abraham, and those folks in Canaan, when Abraham was called out of there of the Chaldees and into the land of Canaan, the Canaanites referred to him as the man who was beyond the river. He came from beyond the river. And so all of his descendants then became referred to as the Hebrews, those folks who are from beyond the river. When they become a nation of people, that is the Hebrew descendants do, they become a nation of people, they wear the name that God gave Jacob, and that was Israel. You could not say the name Israel without saying the name of God. The E-L is God. Kind of interesting, isn't it, when you get to the New Testament? You cannot say the name Christian without saying the name of Christ. God's people always wear his name. And so when you look at those things, and we refer to the Hebrews and their history, we're talking about taking them from Abraham and the promise God made him and tracing them to see if God kept his promise. And that's really what we have in these Old Testament books from Genesis forward. But this Hebrew history is when they became a nation, and they were brought out of Egyptian bondage, and they're about to go into the land that God promised Abraham all those hundreds of years before. This period of time, and that is these particular books, often are called the former prophets. And then we get into those prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and they would be the latter prophets, and that is they take a different portion of the Israelite history. A prophet was a spokesman for God and a servant of God. There's some terminology to be used in the context of these three books that we need to know. When I teach this at Memphis, we go all the way through 1 Samuel in that first study of the Hebrew history. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 9, those prophets are called seers, S-E-E-R. Prophets before time were called, it says, seers. One who speaks what he sees or hears. So that's what a prophet would be. A spokesman for God, and how would he know he's speaking for God? God would have revealed that to him, either showing it to him or speaking those words to him. Amos chapter 7 and verse 12 speaks of that seer and him speaking as a counsel of God. Prophets were also called the man of God. That's kind of an honor, isn't it, for a person to be called a man of God. Now, we're not prophets in the same sense today. God hasn't called us the way he called these men, but we are to be those who speak forth for God. We certainly ought to be men of God, shouldn't we? And we ought to be those that God can depend on. In Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 1, Moses is referred to, and those who speak for God would be referred to their acts as a man of God. Moses was such a man. 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 9 also makes reference to a prophet as a man of God. In 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 18, they're called servants of God. And we're just using this as a background because they'll be mentioned in the context of Hebrew history, those who speak for God. They are those who serve God in at His pleasure, not their own. And so that's why they're called servants. How did you test, or how did they test, whether a prophet was true or false?
Whatever things he spoke would come to pass.
That's right. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, when God promises through Moses that he's going to raise up a prophet like unto Moses, and him they would hear in all things, and Peter says that referred to Christ in Acts chapter 3 and verse 19 to 22. And so when he uses that context, then he says, here's how you're going to know he's a true prophet. If what he prophesies comes true, you know he's a true prophet. What if it doesn't? He's a false prophet. See, when you study these books and you see God's promise through different men, particularly when we get to the last part of the book of Joshua, we're going to have some folks who can be proven to be true prophets. Joshua will say God kept all of his promise, and he gave them all the land that he had promised to Abraham, their father. Moses would be a true prophet because he said, you're going into the land, God's going to keep his promise, and this is it. But we got some folks today not being held accountable, are they? They supposedly are speaking for God. That is their claim. Their claim to be a prophet of God, and yet what they say never comes true. I can remember being a young man and going to service or revival, I think they call it, with a young lady who was a member of the denomination, and the preacher the Russians had taken some of our subs. I don't remember the exact context. It was back in the early 70s, and so there was this crisis with this submarine, and so the preacher that night worked that into his premillennial doctrine, and that this was Gog and Magog, and this was the end of time, and so this is it. You know, these are the last days, and this is what's going to happen. Everybody's sitting there oohing and awing, and here it is, 2009. Didn't happen. Was he a true prophet or false prophet? False prophet. My guess is he's still preaching, still prophesying, still predicting. Nobody's holding him accountable. And yet, they were told how to do that. Now, in this book, we'll have recorded for us a number of things that were prophesied. And we'll find out who the true prophets were. And particularly in reference to God's land promise. And that's important because we have folks today saying God didn't keep the land promise. That they're still anticipating, and they even make political decisions sometimes to help particular nations so that fulfillment of God's promise can come true. That there's going to be an establishment of the nation of Israel, and there's going to be someone sitting on David's throne, and they're going to restore them to that land. And Joshua said, God kept his promise. Now, if God kept his promise, what does it mean if we say they haven't received the land promise yet? So those are the kind of things that can help us today. These things are written time. We're written for our life. And we'll learn those kind of things when we study this book. All right. There are 12 Old Testament books that we would refer to as books of history, and so this is the first one of those. Joshua is, because they're a collective nation and they're about to go into the promised land, and this is the first book that records for us some of those things that are useful to us in looking at their history. When you think about this particular book and the man who is the main character, what does that take you back to in your first introduction to Joshua? Since he's the principal character, what's the first you remember about Joshua?
Being one of the spies, one of the 12.
All right, that's probably the thing that stands out to us most, is he's one of those 12 spies. But we were introduced to Joshua before them.
Moses went on Sinai. He stayed on the mountain.
All right, he was with Moses when he went up on the mountain, but even we backed up a little bit. Remember when they came out of Egypt, the Amalekites came out against them? And the military leader at that particular time was Joshua. And so, from the very first introduction to Joshua, here's a man that Moses had confidence in, evidently God had confidence in, and evidently his fellow Israelites had confidence in. And they went out to battle with him. And he keeps a very close relationship with Moses from that time forward. He does go to the mountain with him. And he goes part of the way up the mountain when he receives the law. And he's one of those present, when they overhear the noise of people, they make the golden calf. And, thought it might be war going on. And kind of gave you context of where he'd be coming from. And then we see him drawing closer and closer and closer to Moses, and God tells Moses, he's the one. You go talk to Joshua because he's going to lead the people into the promised land. You're not. Why did Moses not allowed to lead the people in?
The Senate. Kadesh.
All right, he smote the rock when God told him to speak to it. Does it make a difference? You know, earlier God told him to smite the rock. Does it make any difference whether the rock is smitten or not?
Yes.
It makes a difference whether God told you to smite it or not. That's what makes a difference. And so much so that Moses wasn't allowed to go in. But somebody has to lead these people in. Who's that going to be? Well, it's going to be Joshua. That tells us how that mentoring process took place. So this is not just a man that dropped out of the sky, and they didn't hold an election and say, this is the most popular man among us, and he didn't go around and campaign for weeks and weeks and weeks and say, okay, this is what I'll do if you elect me your leader. God said, you're it. And that's how this book starts, didn't it? Look with me what we learned about in this introductory verse. Now, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, and he's a minister, he's a servant. He's been following Moses around and doing whatever Moses wanted him to do, and now God is saying to him, you're it. You see, real leaders step up and do what needs to be done when it needs to be done for the reason it needs to be done. And Moses is no longer going to be that leader because Moses has died, and Joshua is the one because he's been trained, he's been mentored all this time in the ways of the Lord. And he's seen how to be successful and being obedient to the Lord. He sees what happened when you're not obedient to the Lord. He's fully aware of what disobedience can bring. And so that may be why we have recorded for us, before this book closes and as the book of Judges opens up, that the people were faithful all the days of Joshua. And all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. Because they had their minds fine-tuned to say, God means what he said. He's going to bless us when we're obedient. And he will punish us when we're not. And when they forget that, then we see what happens. He's the son of Nun. It tells us which Joshua he is. And he's probably the second greatest leader in Israel's history. A lot of great leaders. You know, we have men like David and others. You know, we could think of Josiah and we could go down through there and we probably all have favorite characters. But just to know what was on their plate, what was lying before them, the challenges they faced, the inexperience. I mean, they'd never been in the promised land. When you get to David, there's some history and some experience. Joshua, you know, grew up a slave. He'd heard this promise concerning the land. He had rehearsed to him the promise made to Abraham. But somebody's got to fight these battles. And somebody's got to divide up this land. And somebody's got to acknowledge for the first time, all right, here we are. In the land God promised our father Abraham, we possess it. And God's kept his promise. Somebody's got to do that. And it's Joshua who is able to do that. And so, at least from my perspective, you know, and particularly up to this point, he's certainly the second greatest leader. But I think when you have a composite picture of what leadership is, Joshua's it. Maybe in some ways, in some ways superior to Moses in his ability to motivate the folks. He gives two major speeches. Other times he's talking to people or God's talking to him, but he addresses the population of Israel twice in Joshua chapter 23 and Joshua chapter 24. We look at our political leaders and sometimes we assess them historically based on their speeches. You know, when they address the nation, at what context they were in, what that did to the nation, before the nation, we kind of say, wow, you remember this, you remember John F. Kennedy's speech, you remember Abraham Lincoln's speech, and we go through there and we take the context of history and say, that's powerful. The context of history of the nation of Israel, we're talking about Hebrew history, this was a powerful thing. To gather them all before him, just before they go and live in that land, he says, here it is. Here's what God said. Here's what God expects. Here's what God's done in reference to that promise. So major speeches are recorded there. The theme of the book of Joshua particularly deals with the conquest of the land. God never does for us what we can do for ourselves. And so he could have just said, okay, I've just annihilated all the inhabitants of Canaan. Go possess it. In fact, everybody's already been buried. Don't worry about it. Just go possess the land. He could have, couldn't he? Part of the Red Sea. He fed them with manna from heaven. He blew in the quail. He could have blown out the Canaanites, couldn't he? I mean, is his wind just strong enough to blow the quail away, or could he have blown the people away? Well, later on in their history, there were a whole lot of Syria that woke up dead.
That's right.
One angel. But could God have taken care of it? Sent a legion of angels and just took care of the inhabitants of Canaan? Could have. They wanted the people who had lived all their existence in slavery to learn what it meant to be free and to be obedient to Him and say, you can do this as I've directed you to do it. If you do, you'll have what I promised you you'd have. And so the conquest of the land obviously is the emphasis of the book. The division of the land. And that's no small feat. Remember, when you get to that point, they'll cast lots, and tribes will come forth in a certain section of land, and they even make a map. We kind of think we're elite today because we have these topo maps, and we got the lay of the land and where the mountains are and the valleys and forests and streams. And Joshua sending them through the land, and they have to make such a map. They can tell you where the streams are. They know where the mountains are. They know what kind of land is being divided, and so folks need a certain amount of moisture to be able to live there and farm the land and provide for their families, so they divide it up. And this is not just saying, you go this way and I go this way. I mean, they divide it up. This is serious business. That's when you begin to look at great detail into Joshua's leadership. It was a powerful thing. I mean, he was responsible for all that, making sure it was done correctly. And he does that in dividing up land. And that's what the theme of the book is all about. The key thought, how to be successful in life. And we'll read these few verses here. He says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, into the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. In every place that thy sole of your feet shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I did unto Moses, as I said unto Moses. And from the wilderness and this Lebanon unto the great river, the river Euphrates, and all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your coast. And there shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. He says, you're going to be successful. But how? I'm going to be with you. Does it sound anything like the Apostle Paul saying, I can do all things? Now, if you stop there, you wouldn't get the full force of what Paul is saying. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, Joshua could say in his endeavors to conquer this land, I can do all things through God who strengthens me. God said, I'm not going to fail you. Well, it sounds like strength to me. He'll call upon him to be strong and of good courage in verse 6. Well, how is he going to be strong and of good courage? I'm going to be with you. And so that's how we can be successful in life, is to make sure we're doing what God tells us to do. And if we are, we're going to be successful. And we're going to accomplish what He wants us to accomplish. Now, it may be that we lose sight of that, and we have goals and plans that doesn't include God and doesn't promote His cause, and we might not be successful. We might not understand why we weren't successful. See, this context reveals for us what success in life is all about. Follow the instructions. Look at verse 8 and 9. After telling him, back up in verse 7, only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses, my my servant, commanded thee, turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then shalt thou have good success. Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. So follow the instructions. Sounds simple, doesn't it? You see, sometimes in follow the instructions puts us in direct conflict with folks around us. Could you think of a better man to be chosen than someone who went over and looked at the land 40 years prior and saw it was just like God described it, and had confidence and courage and said, let us go up at once and possess it, and watched 10 of his fellow 12 spies said, can't do it, they're bigger than we are, they've already got fortified places. Well, God had already told them that. He had already told them the walls were there. He had already told them the vineyards were planted. He knew people were there. He knew these folks weren't going to just turn it over to them. So God knew all that. And Joshua experienced that. Now God's calling on that experience and saying, you be strong and of good courage. Don't lose that focus that you have. So I couldn't think of a better man than Joshua to carry out this call. Do all he says, and then be strong and of good courage. When you and I are doing what the Lord tells us to do, we ought to be strong and of good courage. You know the passage in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. Again, he emphasizes that we're not to worry about what men might do to us. We're not to fear those. Because God's promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The question is, do we believe it? Since these things are written aforetime, we understand and see in this context, when we read through this book of Joshua, Joshua believed it. He believed it 40 years earlier. He will believe it now. And he will go up as if God's with him. Do not be dismayed. You ever get dismayed? Boy, I do. There are occasions when I think, oh, I can't believe that. You know, I've got to put up with that. Or, oh, if they had just done it a different way. And I think, am I the only one that sees this? You know? Well, maybe I ought to just quit trying. You ever get dismayed like that? You know, I try not to dwell on those things and get caught up in those things, but that's human life. Why would he have to say that to Moses and then repeat that to Joshua if there wasn't a tendency in us to get dismayed about circumstances? There's a tendency to get dismayed. You see, that cost Moses the opportunity to go in the promised land. He got dismayed. Because people are always grumbling, always complaining. And so when God says, speak to the rock, he said, I'd rather smite. You know, just frustrated with these folks and you rebels, and he smites the rock. You see, he became dismayed over the circumstances rather than saying, God hears their grumbling. Yet he told me to speak to the rock. I'm going to speak to the rock, take a deep breath, go for a long walk while they're drinking the water, and come back and we'll go forward. He could have gone into the promised land, but he got dismayed. Joshua will face similar circumstances. God's reminding him, I was with Moses. I'll be with you. So you be strong and good courage. You follow my instructions. You make sure you don't get dismayed. You see, if leadership gets dismayed, guess what? We're all in trouble. We're all in trouble if leadership starts saying, oh, it's bad. It's really, really bad. Oh, when you get up in the morning, it's going to be worse. You know what's going to happen? I'm going to be dismayed. I'm going to say, they're out front. They're facing the giants. And it's really bad. And so if it's that bad to them, I don't know it all like they know it all. It must really be bad. So he's saying to the leader, before he ever presents this to people, here's what I expect out of you. We need such leadership in the church today. There are things that are awful that are going on among the Lord's people today. But leadership ought not get up all the time and say, oh, it's really bad out there. I mean, folks are turning away from the truth right and left. There's not a sound congregation in brotherhood but us. Number one, that's not true. And number two, leaders ought to focus on where the strength is, on God. To say, still got His instruction. He still expects us to follow it. We can't control what everybody else does, but we're going to follow the instructions of the Lord. That's what we're going to do. And so, the Lord never going to leave us nor forsake us. And we're not going to leave the Lord nor forsake Him. Folks will follow you anywhere you lead them if you have that kind of confidence and courage in the Lord. And they will have confidence in the Lord. But when you say, oh, I don't know, they're awful big. There's a whole lot of them. And there are very few of us. I don't know if we can make it or not. Well, then you become dismayed, and when you're dismayed, you set discouragement in the mind of your brethren. Did that happen with the 10 spies when they said, you're not going to believe? I think they are. It said it caused the people's heart to melt. When we get to the book of Judges, well, before we get to the book of Judges, when we get to Rahab's house, the fascinating thing, I don't want to belabor it here and steal all the thunder from the chapter, but the fascinating thing to me is the people over there, heart melted because of Israel. They said, we've heard about your God and what He did to the Egyptians. We've heard about your God and Him parting the Red Sea. We've heard about all your God has done, and our heart melted. And that nation of Israel, those 10 spies, called all of them to say, oh, this is awful, we can't do it. When those folks over there saying, their God's going to help them do it. And there's not a thing we can do about it, except fight to the death, but they're coming. And any God that can take care of Pharaoh in Egypt and drown his forces in the Red Sea, how are we going to stand against that God? Our enemies are like that today. If we'll stand for God and we'll stand for the truth, Satan and his forces are scared to death of the truth. But we get dismayed about it and say, I don't know if the truth works today in 2009. I don't know if anybody's going to listen to it. I don't know if it works anymore. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Our hearts are going to melt and the enemy is going to rejoice because we fainted. So any lessons to learn in this study of Hebrew history? God said, I'll be with you and I'll prosper your way. You see, when we think we've done it ourselves and we can do it by our own power, then our way generally will not be prosperous. But we recognize that every good and every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, and who there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning, then He's the one we serve. Our way is going to prosper. He's going to bless us when we serve Him. And Joshua was told that. Key verse, obviously, for most of us would be Joshua 24:15. Again, he took them their historical context and said, choose you this day whom you will serve. He is the gods of our fathers which were beyond the flood. That's where they got their name, Hebrew. They were beyond the river, flood. They had gods over there, idolatrous gods over there. You either serve those gods, or you can serve the God of the Amorites in whose land we dwell. In the Canaanite environment, you can serve idolatrous gods here. Now, your God has warned you against those things, but you can make that choice. God will allow you to make that choice. But, as for me and my house, we'll serve Jehovah. Now, do you think there's any connection between Joshua chapter 1, what we just read, and his statement in Joshua chapter 24? You see, it's about to all be over as far as Joshua's leadership is concerned. He's going to go to his divided possession. He's going to step back out of the leadership role, and they're going to have to take these truths and embody these principles and live them out in their lives. And he said, then the major choice is going to be who's going to be your God? Who are you going to trust? Whose instructions are you going to follow? I know who I'm going to follow. I know who my family's going to follow. Now, is that leadership? Now, that's not a dictatorial position to say, because I'll take a rod to them and I'll beat them in submission if they don't do what God said. No, he knew they were going to follow him because he was following God. And they had seen in him this confidence in God, and they had seen come true in his life what God promised. That's what we have to provide in our generation. We've got to say, look, it might look bleak all around us. And we may have devastating things happen to us as a nation of people. We might lose our freedom. But nobody can take the truth away from us. Nobody. And if we hang on to the truth of God, you know, you and I can travel, some of you have traveled to other parts of the world where they don't have freedom. But they have the truth, and they're worshiping, and they're serving, and they're evangelizing. How do they do that in a world that is not a republic? They can't vote their leader in or out. How can they do that? Because they serve a true and living God. And so could we? Sure we can. We have to have that same attitude that Joshua had here in this context. He emphasizes there's a choice to be made. That's a key verse because it's a key choice to be made. We have to decide who it is we're going to serve. And then we have to operate in the sphere in which we have the greatest amount of influence, and that's in our families. And we have to serve the Lord. Do you know, those who've had my counseling class will hear me say things that you've already heard, but they need to be in your notes this time, in this context, even though you've heard me say them. You know that I've known the Scriptures all my life. I haven't known all the Scriptures all my life. Still don't know all the Scriptures. But my very, very earliest memories, the first thing I can remember is of my mother reading the Scriptures. Can't remember anything beyond that. But I remember lying there with my head in my mother's lap and her reading. And the first story I remember is the creation story. And the reason I guess that stands out to me is because we lived on a farm and we had, right outside of our, what we call the lot, we fed our cattle and chickens and had our hay and all of our supplies for our animals. Right outside that fence that separated that from the orchard, we had an orchard that had apple trees and peach trees, plum trees, and pear trees. And just beyond the orchard was a garden where we had vegetables. And I thought that was the Garden of Eden. And I'm telling you, in a child like mine, I thought, we live in the Garden of Eden. And she's reading this story, and I thought my favorite place to be was to be out there under that plum tree eating plums. Or pulling a good ripe peach and just eating it. And I thought, if I had access, if I didn't know that word access, I thought, if I could just go to any tree anytime I wanted to and eat, if God told me not to eat of that tree, as long as I could eat of these, I'd be happy. You know, in a child like mine, I was thinking about those things. My mother's reading those Scriptures. So every night I'd fall asleep with my mother reading the Scriptures. I hear that in Joshua saying, it's for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. Those instructions will be what we rehearse. Those instructions will be what we follow. We've already decided what we're going to do. My mother worked in the field all day. She had to cook supper for a large family. I'm one of 11 kids. And yet she still found time to read the Scriptures. But listen, we don't have time today. We're too busy, aren't we? I'm a busy man. I'm preparing sermons to preach. I mean, I've got places to go. I've got to go to Bear Valley and teach Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. I don't have time to sit in my family read Scriptures. I've got more important things to do. You see, when we have that mindset to say, look, this is the world that I live in. I can't make your choices for you. But you've got that choice to make. And you've got to choose this day who you're going to serve. You've got lots of choices. Do we have any choices today? Boy, and I'm a sports fanatic. I can turn on that TV and I can watch ball games from daylight to daylight, from coast to coast, all around the world. And that can become my idol, my focus, my passion. And I can devote that time to it. When I'm working out my sheep and say March Madness is coming, boy, here's who's going to win, and this is what I've got to do. But I don't have time to sit down every day and say, our day is going to close with God speaking to us. Maybe I don't have time every day to get up and say, our day is going to begin with God speaking to us, telling us where to go and what to do. Joshua could say, I know what we're going to do. Now, how could he know that? Because they did it every day. He said, we know what we're going to do, and you choose. And so that's what he emphasizes in that key verse. So Israel's history during the time of Joshua's leadership is what this emphasis is about. It will give us not only an overview of what's going on with the nation as a whole, but it'll give us an insight into what real leadership is all about. The book begins at the death of Moses, and that's what we read in verse 1. A period of mourning has taken place here, and God says, okay, the time of mourning's over. Joshua, Moses is dead. He's not coming back. You almost see this pause, the nation's waiting. Their leader died. Now what? And God said, this is what. Joshua, you're it. And so it begins at the death of Joshua. And that mantle of leadership is passed. That's important for us to remember, because when we get to the book of Judges, that leadership mantle does not pass. It doesn't pass. Now, what about our generation? What about our day? You say, boy, I grew up in a congregation where we had good leaders. And I did. I grew up in a congregation where our elders would get up and preach. And when we were between preachers, and that is when a preacher would move away, and before they hired another one, they didn't say, oh, we got to get somebody in that pulpit. We got to hurry up. I mean, what are our choices? We got 3 guys. We don't like any of them. Well, we got to hire one of them because we got to have somebody in the pulpit. They never missed a beat. Some of the best preaching I ever heard in all my life was our local leaders. So you see, that's who they're supposed to be. They're supposed to know God's Word. They're not even qualified to serve as leaders. They don't. They're supposed to have led members of their family to know the Lord and obey His will, because that's what their job is going to be as leaders. So what are they going to get up and speak on? Those things that they've experienced and God's blessings in their life, and say, this is what we're going to do. I heard some sermons that I think must have been like what the Israelites felt like when they heard Joshua speak. I had some elders, when they put their hand on my back and say, will you prepare a lesson for Wednesday night? I don't want to be a preacher. I don't get before people. When my elder asked me to do it, what do you think I did? Scared out of my wits. Guess what I did? What he asked me to do. Why? Because I saw him do it. You see, that's what we're going to have. These things are written aforetime, written for our learning. You and I are going to have to take these lessons and say, how do we apply them today? And let's quit making excuses why we can't do what the Lord told us to do. If He said we can carry the gospel to all the world, let's quit making excuses why we can't. Well, we can't agree on anything. Well, I can't get the money to go. And well, I don't know what they're doing when they get over there. We'll make 1,000 excuses. And we're forgetting all the time, God said go. He promised never leave us nor forsake us. He promised to always be with us. He told us not to fear what men might do to us. And we have all the ingredients of success. Why don't we just do it? And why don't we challenge each other to say, I can't make a decision for you or for other folks, but we've already made the decision. You know what happens in most congregations? I shouldn't say that. You know what happens in most of the congregations that I've experienced? Even among leadership, unfortunately. We start testing, what are you going to do? Well, if they're going to do it, I'll do it. That's not how you make decisions. And who's doing the talking here? God is. Who's setting the direction here? God is. Who's telling them what to do? God is. And so if leaders say, okay, here's what God told us to do. Now we've got some opportunity to do that. We can have some choices as to how to do that. But do that we must. And not say, well, we've got a whole lot of folks in the congregation that just, they're just not really for it. It doesn't matter whether they're for it or not. Does it? It doesn't matter if they're for it. What happened to those 10 spies that said, we're not for it? They died in the wilderness. What happened after they died in the wilderness? God said, okay, now it's time to go. Did He say, I guess we'll just remove the promised land from the plan. If they want to build a house here, I'll take them all the way back to Egypt, and I'll just kind of kill the Egyptians off. I'll let them live there. Did God change His plan? No, He waited until a generation said, we'll go up and we'll do it. We don't have to have that kind of attitude now. I don't mean to get preachy about it in the introductory remark, but I want you to know this is a passionate thing for me. It's not just a class to teach 3 books at the Bear Valley Bible Institute. It's to say what truths can we learn so we can have an effect on the generation in which we live. sometimes we read these characters like, particularly when we look at Joshua receiving that mantle from Moses, we think, oh wow, Joshua, what a guy. And he was. What about this generation? We need any Joshua? Do we? Well, I couldn't be a Joshua. Why not? We read these characters almost like they're fairy tales. Like, oh, it couldn't happen today. I mean, we couldn't have a Joshua today. I mean, Joshua was a man. And God spoke to Joshua. Well, He's spoken to me. Now, He hadn't spoken to me directly like He did Joshua, but when He records for me, all Scripture is given by the inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Now here it is. We talked about Joshua was a man of God. That the man of God might be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Now can I do it? If I'm willing to follow His instructions, I can. Might it be hard? It might be real hard. I mean, these were real people they had to fight. There were real battles ahead of them. But God kept His part of it. And so this mantle of leadership is passed on, and what a great leader Joshua is. The book starts where Deuteronomy ends, and it ends with the death of this leader. So quite significant for us to pay attention as to the events. And we're going to try to make sure we cover. We'll have to get in a hurry to do that. We'll have to cover Joshua today and tomorrow, and then we'll have to take 2 days to do Judges and Ruth, hopefully together. But we're going to highlight those chapters and those events and try to glean from that those things that we can take home with us and say, this works. We're not going to make application to the Old Testament law. We're certainly not making application to fighting for a physical land. But those principles of a relationship with God in obedience to His instructions and success because of that are certainly lessons we can learn. And these books then ought to take on a specific meaning to us when we go back and look at those things. All right, a simple outline of the book itself is those preparations that are made to occupy the land, and that's in those first 5 chapters. He will say, and we'll break that down when we get into the outline itself, but he'll tell Joshua, okay, it's time to go in, tell people to get the victuals together, here's how you set them in order, there's things you're going to do. He sends out 2 spies, they make preparation to kind of see how the lay of the land is, and they line up in order as God directs them to, and they cross the Jordan River. Because a generation that witnessed the parting of the Red Sea is dead, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. And so this generation needs to see that same power and might of God. That's why when we get to the last chapter of the book of Joshua, and we get to those first 2 chapters of the book of Judges, it talks about all the great things that God had done. And the people were faithful all the days of Joshua and the elders because they witnessed and saw and kept alive that image of being in awe of God and His power. And so we see those things being set in order. There's some preparation that has to be made. Any leadership knows you can't just get up and make an announcement and say we're going to do this. There has to be some preparation made to say, okay, what's involved here? What's it going to take? How are we going to get there? How do we make sure the congregation knows we know where we're going? And we know how we're going to get there. We know what God said about it. You see, all those things have to be done ahead of time. God speaking to the leader and said, this is what I want you to do. This is the order I want you to do it in. Now you go address the people. That's why it ought to always take place in reference to leadership. In chapter 6 through chapter 12, we have the conquest of Canaan itself. We're finally there, and we're finally in a position to drive out those enemies. And 6+ chapters are given to those battles and that experience in the conquering of the land. We'll get an impression that God will support His people as long as His people are doing what He tells them to do. And then those tribal allocations, and though we won't go verse by verse and look at those things, we will highlight that each of the tribes are represented and how they got to be represented in the order they were represented and how the land was divided accordingly. Even some of those real subtle prophecies that were made with people like Jacob when he blessed his sons, and he predicted what would happen because of some of their behavior in life. When you start dividing the land, it'll remind us this is because. What does that tell us? God doesn't forget. Well, there's a lot going on here. We're conquering the land, and we're fighting these enemies, and we're finally working together, and why would God remember that? Because God told you He would remember that. He told you He's serious about our behavior, and there are always consequences to our sin. And so those things remind us of who God is and what God expects of us. And again, though we may look at it being a subtle thing, when you get to that point, He said, this is why this tribe was reduced to this portion of land. You got Simeon who dropped way down here. Really, he ended up blending into another tribe because of his participation in causing the people of Shechem, to be circumcised, and then they slaughtered them when they forced his sister and shamed Jacob. And so Jacob let him know that it cost you. And here's what it's going to reduce you to. He gets this barren land down at the bottom, kind of what's left over from the division of the tribes, and pretty much becomes part of another tribe. But that's significant. When we read and study, we say, okay, this year I'm going to read through the Bible. We start reading, we skip over genealogy, and we skip over things like dividing up the land. Here are those names again, and that section of land. We don't live there anymore, so that's not important. It becomes important because here's the breadth of the land that God had said multiple times to Abraham and his descendants. You look this way, you look that way, you look that way, and you look that way, it's yours. And He gave them some boundaries. Guess what's going to be reminded, we're going to be reminded of when the land divides up? Boundaries. Why? Because God said, this is going to be your land. From this point to this point. When they divided up, here we have it. And so that's not insignificant. When you get the enemies at bay and the land starts being divided up, Joshua reminds them, God kept His promise. He kept all of His promise to us. And then obviously the last part of the book, those last 3 chapters deal with His farewell speech. And He reminds them not only will He go the way of all the earth, but there's some expectations that God has of them and that He has of them in reference to how they are to keep their position in the land. They're supposed to come back in a little while and give us the break. I haven't kept up the time, but I'm assuming they are. When they come to restart the recording, we'll take a break. But in reference to a detailed outline, and we'll come back and make a few more comments about Joshua personally a little later on in reference to the different names that are used for Joshua and what that might mean to us. But a more detailed outline has us receiving this commission, or Joshua receiving that commission. We read those first 9 verses. When you began in verse 10, that Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, pass through the host and command the people, saying, prepare you victuals, for within 3 days you shall pass over this Jordan and go in to possess the land, which the Lord your God giveth you to possess it. He didn't say, now, wait a minute, how did we have an introduction to Moses when he was chosen to be the leader? To go back and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Can't do it. I'm wrong one, can't speak very well, and what am I going to say when they ask me, who gave you this authority by his own brethren? What am I going to tell Pharaoh? And God took all of his excuses away. But here's Joshua, who seemingly has learned from that experience. He doesn't make any excuses, does he? What does he do immediately after God gives him that commission? Goes to address the people. Here's what he did. You start making preparations. Sound like he's confident in God? In 3 days, we're crossing over. And you get your things ready. Leaders ought to do that. When we realize what God told us to do, we need to make sure it is God's will and purpose, and then we need to get the folk ready. Do God's bidding. We've kind of, unfortunately, intentionally made the church setting kind of a social setting, and we get comfortable doing things together that doesn't necessarily promote the cause of Christ and as far as evangelism is concerned, but we really like each other. Nothing wrong with liking each other. Nothing wrong with getting together, doing things together, but if that's all we ever do, is that really what He sent us to do? You see, they liked each other, and they had 40 years to get rid of folks that didn't like each other. And so these folks pretty much like each other. And some of them have already made their homes on this side of the river. They could all, I guess, make their homes over there if they just wanted to make it a period of fellowship. But see, they had purpose. They knew where they were going. They knew what God had promised, and they knew they had to be the ones to drive the people out. And then he begins to rehearse in verse 12 to those who decided to stay on this side of the land. And it takes us back to the book of Numbers in chapter 32 when Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh had asked permission of Moses if they could, since they defeated the kings on this side of the land, if they could just live here. And you remember Moses told them they could, but they would have to do what? They would have to go over and fight with their brethren when they cross over the river. You can live here, but you still have to fight the battle. Why? And what's just the practical reason for that? How did they get the land they're going to be possessing?
Got the enemies out.
Who did? Just Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh?
No.
No, all of Israel fought. All Israel fought and defeated those kings. And so here are people who are possessing land that their brethren had helped them possess. So what are they going to do with their brethren? They have to cross over the river and help their brethren face their enemy. And Moses had told them in Numbers chapter 32, you can have this land. But if you don't cross over and you don't fight, be sure your sin will find you out. And so these tribes are told to prepare themselves. Their wives and their little ones and shall remain in the land. And but they're going to have to go over and fight with their brethren until their brethren have rest in that land. Notice their answer. It kind of tells us what good leadership can expect. And they answered Joshua, saying, all that thou commandest us, we will do. Whithersoever thou sendest us, we will go. According as we hearkened unto Moses in all things, so will we hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses. Well, we know something about their history, and we know Israel as a whole didn't always do what Moses told them to do. But we have a generation who did, who followed his directions in the wilderness, who fought the battles that he charged them to fight, and are now positioned to go into the land because Moses' last speech to them was, I've seen the land. And God's going to keep his promise to you. Now you go over and take it. And so they're prepared to do that. With the leadership of Moses getting them to this point, and the leadership of Joshua to take them over, these folks are ready to go. Yes, sir.
Well, Jay, before you go any further, there's a question that I want to ask. This is regarding the nature of God. As we see him in the New Testament, he's somewhat different to the way he dealt with his people then. And especially something that depicts war, where God is calling them out to go to this land that he had promised Abraham. And in the attempt to take this land, it required for them to be physically involved in battle. And I know sometimes, the reason I'm asking the question is sometimes you get these kind of questions asked by others from you. Well, how could God be this way when he's so peaceful in the New Testament? Yet we know for a fact that in the New Testament we read more about the terror of God than we read in the Old Testament.
I think that question is easily answered if you heard what Brother Joshua was referring to. People's concept of the God of the Old Testament is this warlike God, that bringing out vengeance upon these Canaanite folks and sending his people in to annihilate them. And to get to the New Testament, he's a God of love, of peace. I think what we can't lose sight of is it's the same God. And he has the same adversement toward sin now than he did then. And the reason he sends them in to destroy these people is because their iniquities were full. He gave them opportunities to do differently, and they weren't different. And so, what does he tell us to do today? Are we passive, non-militant people? We don't have number one, in the New Testament setting, we don't have a physical land promised to us. That's already been fulfilled. When this book closes, it will have been fulfilled. But the other part of that promise to Abraham had not been fulfilled. And that is, through Abraham, all the nations of the earth be blessed. Now, you and I are part of that blessing, that promise, and that charge. We have to be as militant about carrying the gospel to the world and fighting that spiritual battle as they did that physical battle. Same God. He still hates sin the same way. What happens when we preach the gospel? What's that all about? Repent and be baptized, every one of you, for the remission of your sins. What is that? That's declaring war against Satan and his forces.
That's right.
And you have to drive those sins out of people's lives, and they have to conform to the Lord's will, and those who don't are going to be eternally lost. Same God. But now we're dealing with a spiritual warfare. You read Ephesians chapter 6 and tell me we're not in war. He's telling his people, you get ready. And you make sure that you understand who we're fighting against. We're being prepared to be equipped to fight against the wiles of the devil. In order to do that, we have to put on the whole armor of God. He's telling these folks, we're about to go over there, and we're going to face the enemy. Get ready. And we've conquered some of the enemies over here, and you're going to have to go up and fight over there. Those of us who have conquered enemies in our life, and we've rid ourselves of sin in our lives, and we've been washed by the blood of the Lamb, we can't say, victory's over. You know, I'm saved. Wonderful. Marvelous. Brother Brown said, saved by the grace of God. What about those who don't know about the grace of God? Well, listen to the context. Having done all the stand therefore, having your loins girded about with truth, having your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel, putting on the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And in the hand, he said, the shield of faith that shall be able to ward off all the fiery darts of the evil one. Sound like a battle to you? What about those folks out there who don't have that armor yet? Who's the enemy? Satan is. Now, so we don't get lost in people saying, well, you know, the God of the Old Testament, boy, he's just so mean. You know, he said, kill everything that's breathing. How awful is that? How merciful is that? To make sure those infants don't grow up into idolatry that have to be separated from a righteous God eternally. How compassionate is that? To those nations of people that said, we've formed our own God. We're not going to accept any other God. How are they going to spend eternity? Separate from God. Now, so you can look at it that way, or you can play the cultural thing of our day and say, but the God of the New Testament is just a God of love. He has always been a God of love. There's never been a time when he wasn't a God of love. But he has never tolerated sin from anyone, anywhere. Nor will he ever tolerate sin. The prophet Isaiah would say, the Lord's hand is not shortened that he cannot save. It is his ear heavy that he cannot hear. If your sins have separated between you and your God, and your iniquities have hid his face from you. So that's how we have to look at it. That's how I answer folks. Same God. Physical promise, he kept it. But they had to fight the battles to get it. He didn't do for them what they were expected to do for themselves. Spiritual promise. Jesus said to those disciples, much like God said to Joshua here, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God? believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go and prepare a place for you, and if I prepare a place for you, I will come again, receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you might be also. Now, if you just stop there and you said, He's gone to prepare a place in heaven for us, He's wonderful, and God so loved the world, He gave Him to that purpose, and He's the way, the truth, and the life, and all that's true. But how do we get from here to there? Did He just say, I'm going to go do it all for you, you don't worry about it? No. No, He's called upon us, and here's what you got to do. If you're going to be my disciple, here's what you got to do. You got to, first of all, deny yourself. That means the first battle you got to fight is you got to put yourself to death. Can you do that? Can you put yourself to death so you can live for the Lord? You got to decide that. And if you can decide to do that, then what you're going to recognize is you have to do that daily. You have to make that conscious choice to say, I'm not serving myself today, I'm serving Him today. We have to take up our cross. The cross is a constant reminder of death. Every day we've got to take up that cross. It's not an old burden we drag through life. Oh, this is terrible. But I got to bear my cross. This is the worst life in the world you could live. So burdensome, but I got to carry my cross. No, you've got to be reminded you cannot become self-centered. Now, if we don't learn any of the lessons from Joshua Judges, we'll learn that one. There will come a time when every man will do that which is right in his own eyes. God will not have first place, and they will lose all their blessing and privilege. The same will happen to us spiritually. He's going to prepare a place for us, but what if we don't prepare here? What if we don't prepare to stand against the wiles of the devil? What if we don't do all within our power to stand? What if we don't put on the equipment that He has given us to put on to face that enemy? Then who could say God is not and has not always been a God of love? And who could say God has not always been a God of vengeance against unrighteousness? He's always been. Ask Adam and Eve. Ask Noah's generation. Ask the Canaanites. Ask the Israelites. Ask every generation. Does God mean what He says? He does. Does that make Him mean? No. That makes Him righteous. Makes Him righteous. Now let's put those together. The love and grace and mercy of God and the expectations of God. And that brings us comfort and confidence, because a God that's consistent is a God that we can trust. A God that's mad one time and blows up and abusive, and next time He's just very calm and tame and loving and syrupy. You think, whoa, what mood is He going to be in today? That's not how God's ever depicted. He's always been angered at sin. Never tolerated it in His presence. Put up with it until people had an opportunity to correct it. When they didn't, He removed it from Him. Now, we'll say, God's a God of grace because the New Testament is a book of grace. The Old Testament not. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis chapter 6, before the Old Testament law was even given. Anytime God's been present and He's dealing with man, He's always been gracious. He's always been kinder to man than man deserves. What is that? That's grace. But He will always eventually bring about justice for those who refuse His grace. Titus chapter 2 and verse 11. The grace of God. And I'm assuming that's what Brother Hankey was asking about. The love of God, obviously, He's exhibited in His grace, because that's when He's extended to us. The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men. Now, how much more could God extend grace and say, it's available to everybody? The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men, teaching us. Now, here's where we are in the book of Joshua. He said, don't forget my instruction. You remember my instruction, you're going to be successful. Teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. He equips us, instructs us, so that we can have what He intended for us to always have. The question is, will we choose Him or not? That's how the book ends. Joshua say choose. Now, if you're looking at it and say, whoa, did you see what God did to those Canaanites? Whoa, did you see what God did to those Egyptians? Then you might choose that adulterous God that you can just make look any way you want to. Say anything you want him to say. But if you say, he drowned those Egyptians because they did not listen to what he said. He said, let my people go. They could have still been alive. They let his people go. He didn't kill the Canaanites because he was just a mean God having a bad day. Their iniquity was full. You know, the Israelites spent all that time in bondage. What were the Canaanites doing? Whatever they wanted to do. And so you have to look at it that way, and here's probably what we need to make a pact to do. Great question. I took too long to answer it, but those things are passionate to me because I don't like people who would misrepresent my God. And that's a misrepresentation of God to say one way here and another way here. It's always the same. In fact, he describes God through his Son in Hebrews chapter 13 that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Do you believe that or not? Well, I believe that. And so he's never going to tolerate sin. Never has, never will. It doesn't matter how many of us vote and say, we don't call that sin anymore. If it's ever been sin to God, it will always be sin to God, no matter what you think or say. And he will separate you from him if you practice or condone such. You don't believe that? Read Romans chapter 1. When you turn away from God, he'll finally give you over to your own minds, and he not only will bring punishment on those who do such things, but those who have pleasure in them to do so. God's consistent. I'm glad he's consistent. I know where the parameters are. I know he loves me. But I know he will not tolerate sin. And so here's what we probably need to do in the class is, unless you have a question that you think, if I don't get the answer to this and the Lord returns, I'm not sure I'm going to be saved. If you have one of those questions, please ask it. Don't know that I can answer it, but I want the answer to it, and we'll stop and find it. Because if we're going to be lost, if we don't have it, then we'll just say that's what this class is going to be about, searching for that answer. But otherwise, let's make a pact to do this. Save your questions until we get to the end, and if they haven't been answered in our discussion, then we'll try to make some time to say, all right, what questions you have. I'll pause every now and then and ask you what questions you have. I'm really asking that to say, in the context we've just covered, the verses we've just gone over, there's something about that you got a question about, okay? Not fussing at you, Brother Anke. I think it's a good question. But I can just see from my answer, that's where the problem's going to be. Because, I get to preaching, and say, oh yeah, that brings me to this point. Oh yeah, this point. And then Brother Denny will say, how did Joshua judge in Greek? I say, well, we got through Joshua. That's all we got to do. Okay? All right. So, Joshua's commission and to lead the people into the Canaan land and then prepare for the crossing of the Jordan. Again, God didn't just take them in a cloud and just move them over there. Here's this massive nation of people. They had to cross the Jordan River. I think sometimes we lose sight of that. I live in Memphis, and they say our population is, depending on how broad you make the suburbs, but better than 600,000 people. And I get caught in those traffic jams, and everywhere you look, there was people. And you think, what if we had to all line up and cross the Mississippi River? We're right there on the bank of the Mississippi River. You had to line all those folks up, get them orderly, and say, stand still, O Israel, and see the salvation of the Lord. And then the water part, and make sure they all walk across on dry land. They'll say, I'm not going to get out in the middle of that river. I'm not sure I can make it. All those things are realities, aren't they? Here's 600,000 plus people, 603,000 people above the age of 20. And they're going to cross the Jordan River. How? We just read the story and say, oh, they crossed the Jordan River. How? Well, they had to line up. How did they learn to line up in 40 years? All right, get the tribes in order. That kind of starts simplifying it. Okay, all you folks are responsible for this. And then, okay, get the priests where they need to be. And, okay, let's represent God in this and understand this is the mission of God and purpose of God. And you stand there in the middle of that river as a symbol that you trust God. And you let all the people get across. And then when you do, I'll tell you when you can come over. I mean, there was some order to this, wasn't it? And some symbolism to say, who told us to go over? If he told us to go over, are we going to make it? Yeah. Now, how long would it take to evacuate a city the size of Memphis? Ask New Orleans. Wasn't much order to that, was it? Everybody waiting on everybody else to say, probably needs to commence to think about, perhaps, getting out of the way of this hurricane. Then we start saying, well, he didn't, well, she didn't, well, somebody should have. Well, any plans to get out? Well, God said, go get the people ready. And he gets the people ready in this context of these first 18 verses. And then we get to chapter 2, the conquest of the land begins. It emphasizes for us in this context some very important things. You see, we've looked at in those first 9 verses, chapter 1, God charged to Joshua and what he expected him to do, and what he rehearsed with him and what was expected of him. And he was able to carry that out because of his training and because of the mentoring of Moses and because of his understanding and image of God and his confidence in God. But now the real proof of the pudding takes place. It is Joshua, and you can't just say, get ready to go. You've got to go. How many times do we have business meetings and elders meetings, and we talk about thinking about perhaps somehow, someday, doing something for the Lord? You know, they say, all right, our next meeting we'll kind of narrow that down and see if we can agree on how we need to do it. Well, they're at the point where they've got to go in, and Joshua's the man to lead them in. These folks said they're ready. They responded, verse 16 through 18, we'll go up. And in fact, they said, if anybody rebels against the commandments, then and will not hearken unto thy word. They're talking to Joshua. The people saying, if anybody says they're not going to do it, he shall be put to death. Only be strong and good courage. Boy, isn't that nice? God says to Joshua, be strong and of good courage. And Joshua goes and tells the folks, here's what we're going to do. Be strong and good courage. And the echo back from the people is, we're behind you. We're going to do what you tell us to do. For anybody that chooses not to, they're going to be put to death because we're going to do what God said to do. And you, as our leader, you be strong and good courage. Wouldn't that be wonderful in a congregation? For us to go and say, this is what God told us to do. And let God speak to us and hear God say, you can do it and I'll never leave you nor forsake you. And for the leaders say, God told us to do it and we can do it. But we've got to be strong and good courage. And the echo come back from the congregation, we're going to do it. If anybody grumbles about it, complains about it, we're going to discard them to the side. They're not going to hold us back or distract us. And you as elders, you be strong and good courage because we're going to do that. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, what lessons can we learn? It says Joshua the son of Nun, chapter 2, sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and came in to a harlot's house named Rahab and lodged there. It was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, there came men in hither tonight of the children of Israel to search out the country. I wonder why they think that might be the reason they're coming over. Rahab would tell us in this context why that is. You think it's a coincidence? You think it's a coincidence that Joshua just sends out 2 spies? He sent out 12 before, representing all the tribes, and what happened? Oh, they got all confused and discouragement set in because 10 of them brought back an evil report. And so Joshua must have been very selective and said, did you two fellows go over? All we're going over to do is just kind of stop land, because we're going over to accomplish the task at hand. So they go over to the land in this chapter, and they spend some time seeing what's there. And the whole purpose was to come back and tell Joshua and the people what they found. They're going to bring back a report as to how they go about taking care of this. And we have in this story of Rahab some interesting insight as to what they find when they get there. The king of Jericho gets searching for these spies, and Rahab hides them. The scripture doesn't cover up her reputation or her past, and she's acknowledged as being a harlot. And so she took those spies in, she hid them, and when they came searching for them, verse 5 said, it came to pass that after the time of shutting the gate, when it was dark, that the men went out. Whither the men went, I wot not. She's telling the king this. Pursue after them quickly, for ye shall overtake them. And she had brought them up to the roof of the house. Tells us something about the time of the writing. Must have been harvest time, because she has some flax and stalks on her house, which she laid in order upon her roof. And so the men pursue after where they think these two spies have gone, and at the ford of Jordan. And then the conversation takes place between Rahab and the spies. And I think it's important enough for us to kind of listen to what I mentioned to you in the introductory remarks in reference to what the people of the land thought about the Israelites and the God of Israel. She says, and before they were laid down, she came unto them upon the roof, and she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land. Wow. Isn't that powerful? Here's this heathen woman on the other side of the Jordan, who's among those that God's sending to say, you utterly destroy this people, and you're going to possess the land, and she believes it. Not to go back to my sermon, but to go back to what Brother Joshua asked a moment ago, this loving God spared Rahab. Why? Because she believed in God. And she had that same kind of faith in Him. She's willing to submit her life to Him and become one of His people. And so did He spare her? Yes, He did. Did His people treat her kindly? He did. He's in the lineage of Christ. The loving God ignore her? No. And so it's all a matter of doing what God tells you to do. So she had this faith. She said the inhabitants of the land. Notice it says in the last part of verse 9, and terror is fallen upon us, that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. A whole generation died in the wilderness because their heart fainted, where all the time these people said, we can't do it. These folks are too great, and their God's too powerful. She said, for we heard how that the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you. They heard that. Now, when we get to the book of Joshua, the Israelites will forget that. Will that become significant? This heathen woman not only heard that, but believed that. There will be a generation among the people of Israel that don't hear it and don't believe it or have forgotten it. And they began to worship other gods. And when you came out of Egypt, that you did under the king of Amorites, and that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, which you utterly destroyed. Now, you remember Reuben, Manasseh, and Gad and the half the tribe of Manasseh stayed on that side of the land, and they were reminded in Numbers chapter 32 that their brethren had fought with them, where they fought these kings. Did this woman and these people of Jericho know that? Did they have it correct? Had the right king? Had the right battles? They knew who won. And who had won? Israelite. Who does she give credit for? Their God. Now, who she thinks is going to take care of Jericho and all these other cities and all these other people? The same God. That's who she thinks is going to be. And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did they remain any more courage in any man. And what did God tell Joshua to do? Be strong and of good courage. See, these people don't have God. And what did she say? We didn't have courage anymore. What that might tell us, if we don't have courage today to do what God tells us to do, is we really don't have God. We don't believe Him. Well, I know He said He'd be with us, but I didn't know it was going to cost me so much economically. I know He said He'd be with us, but I didn't know people were going to be so ugly to me. I know He said He'd be with me, but I thought I'd keep my physical health. He said we'd make all these conditions, and that's not what God said. He just said, you be strong and of good courage, and you'll have what I promised you to have. Now, what's He promised us that we'll have? Not physical answer. He promises we'd have heaven. Now, the question is, do we believe that? Isn't that what He said in John 14? Don't let your heart be troubled. Don't be dismayed. Don't be discouraged. If you believe in God, then you believe also in me. So here this woman believes that. And she has this clear, distinct image of God that the Israelite people did not have 40 years earlier, or at least a large number of them. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord. Which Lord is she talking about? All right, the Israelite Lord. Since I have showed you kindness, that you will also show kindness unto my father's house and give me a true token, that ye will save alive my father and my mother and my brethren and my sisters and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. And the men answered her, our lives for your life, if you utter not this our business. And it shall be that when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee. And then she let them down by a cord through the window. For her house was upon the town wall, and she dwelt upon the wall. And she said unto them, get you to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you, and hide yourselves there 3 days, until the pursuers be returned, and afterwards you may go your way. And the men said unto her, we will be blameless of this thine oath, which thou hast made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, thou shalt bind this line of scarlet thread in the window, which thou didst let us down by, and thou shalt bring thy father and thy mother and thy brethren and all thy father's house home unto thee. It shall be that whosoever shall go out the doors of thy house into the streets, his blood shall be upon his head, and we will be guiltless. And whosoever shall be with thee in the house, his blood shall be on our head, if any hand be upon him. And if thou utter this our business, then we will be quit of thine oath which thou hast made us swear. And she said, according unto your word, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed, and she bound the scarlet line in the window. And they went and came into the mountain and abode there 3 days, until the pursuers were returned. The pursuers sought them throughout all the way, but found them not. So the 2 men returned and descended from the mountain and passed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun and told him all the things that befell them. And they said unto Joshua, truly the Lord hath delivered into our hands all the land, for even all the inhabitants of the country do faint because of us. What's significant about what you learned there compared to what you learned in Numbers chapter 13 and 14? You get a perspective of the people in the land and how they view God and His people. And you get a perspective of 2 spies that came back with an entirely different report, with great confidence, much like Joshua and Caleb were, but they were arguing against their 10 brethren who were louder and whined and complained and were faint-hearted. And because of that, they were defeated. How did these men see the condition? They were sent over to spy out the land. What was their report? The land's already ours. And these people already recognize it. Their hearts faint because of us. So we get some insight as to what the attitude of the people of the land was in the story of Rahab. It's not a fictitious story. It's a real person who dwelt in that land, a real person who will be in the lineage of Christ. And so she not only was spared from being killed at Jericho, but she evidently became a proselyte Jew and practiced the statutes and judgments and laws and commandments of the Jehovah God that she feared. She really did fear him. And it wasn't because she just scared of him, though that obviously was true. They were frightened of his power and his might, but she came to know him in the sense that we know what he's going to do for you. We know he's promised you this land. She said, and when he gives you this land, what kind of confidence do you have in God? He's going to keep his promise. Oh, that we had that kind of confidence in God. He's going to keep his promise. And we, above all people, need to learn the lessons from this book. Because these things are written for our learning. And when God tells us to do something, we want to do it. Because we know what God promised. He is going to perform. But He expects us to perform what He instructs us to perform. He gave very clear, distinct instructions. And now we have a generation that's going to carry them out. They will be successful. And we'll see the details of that success when we come back after the break and pick up with what we have then beginning in chapter 3 with their preparation to cross over Jordan and conquer the land. We'll take a short break and we'll come back.